really quiet, so I'm just going to go ahead and start. But we do technically have a few minutes. But there are a couple things before we get started, before we get into tonight. I want to address really quickly just a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll have a prayer, and then we'll get into the class. But two things. One is, last week I mentioned that I learned a song when I was little that had the word moraine in it, and I didn't know what that word meant. And I didn't know what that word meant until I looked it up fairly recently, and it was brought to my attention that I never actually explained what the word moraine means. And so I'm not alone in not knowing what that word means. But moraine is just another word for plague, from what I understand. Apparently there is another disease nowadays called moraine it's a disease amongst livestock that kills them. It has a very high mortality rate, a very high infection rate. Really the only way to treat what's now called moraine is to completely isolate and separate the infected cattle and kill them. It's really that intense of a disease. But again, this was miraculous, so I want to make that distinction as well, that it's not like bioweapon, like it's not, that's not exactly what happened. It's a miracle. It was a plague. It was God acting, so I just want to make that clear. But that's what the word moraine means, just so we all know. And then another question that was brought to my attention, which I had this question as well, is when you think about the plagues and you think about the timeline of the plagues, I don't know about you, I picture the plagues almost happening one day after the other, which I don't really have an argument for that. That's just kind of how I pictured it in my head. But then, if you think about the cattle die, and then we're told that the next plague is the boils, and the livestock are affected by the boils, but we were also just told that all of the livestock were killed in the moraine of cattle. So I looked that up, and there's a few answers for that different commentators give. Number one is a time lapse. I think that might maybe be one of the easier ones to deal with. We're not told that they happened one after the other, but there could have been maybe a couple days, or I don't know how long that would have been. There aren't really any estimates as far as what that time lapse would be like between the plagues. But again, that's one of those things that's just not in the text. We're not told it was the next day, and we're not told it was 5 years later. I don't think it was 5 years later, but there just doesn't really, that's just kind of one answer that people will give. Number two, this one kind of makes a lot more sense to me, is that they could have traded livestock with the Hebrews. Obviously not traded if all of theirs were dead, but they could have bought livestock from the Hebrews. Also, if you think about it, if one group is enslaved and the people who own the slaves are in need of animals, where are they going to get animals from? The enslaved people. So that kind of makes more sense to me, whether they were stolen or bought or however that worked. They could have gotten animals from the Hebrews or other surrounding nations. Another explanation that's given is that, which this one kind of makes me nervous a little bit, because I never want it to sound, I don't like the argument where sometimes people will say the Bible didn't really mean what it said when it said whatever. So some people will say, rather than all the livestock dying, it means all manner of livestock or all kinds of livestock. So if you think about it, like if 99% of the cattle were wiped out and 99% of the sheep were wiped out, but then that still would have left a little bit of a remnant, that doesn't seem to compute to me. Stu?
The fifth plague?
Yes.
So one of the things that I always look at is in verse 3, where it says the livestock that are in the field. So there's lots of livestock, but this says specifically this, the livestock that's in the field. So then livestock that weren't in the field at that time had boils, could have been hail later on in other plagues. It could have been the firstborn of those animals that later died. But this plague, I don't look at it as it killed every single livestock. I see it as killed the livestock that were in the field.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is certainly another explanation as well. It does say in the field, so it could be that the livestock or the animals that were being kept in a certain place, for example, in the field, were all killed, but then there were other livestock that could be affected by the boils and other animals that later could be affected by the 10th plague, like Stu said. So there are kind of other explanations for this. I don't want to camp there too long, but I just kind of want to offer some explanations for something that we kind of glossed over last week. But with all that being said, we're going to get into the last couple of plagues and the Passover and the journey to Sinai. But before we get too far, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful to you for this time that we have together to study your word, learn more about the Exodus, learn more about the incredible miracles and the incredible signs and wonders that you worked to get your people out of bondage in Egypt. We thank you for the examples that we have to learn, the positive and negative examples that we see. We know that you are sovereign. We know that you watch out for your people, and you always have a plan, even when we don't see it or understand it, and we thank you for that. Thank you for taking care of us. Thank you for delivering us from sin, most importantly, and please help us to have open minds and open hearts to be able to understand what we have before us in the scriptures throughout this class. Thank you again for this opportunity, and it's in your son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so jumping right back into the plagues, and if you remember, we left off with the 8th plague. Now we're getting into the 9th plague really quickly. Darkness is really interesting to me because when you think about darkness, and especially in a world like we have today, in a modern world where we have so much electricity, we have light pollution, it's very, very hard to be in a place that's completely dark. Even if we were to turn out all the lights right now, we would have backup lights, or we would have little lights, different places. We have the exit signs that would be lighting up. It's really hard to imagine just how dark this was, but I have on here, fire didn't work, ? Because if you think about it, God's not going to be, if God sends a plague of darkness, it's not like he's going to be stumped by the fact that, we can just start a fire for ourselves. So there would have had to have, I would imagine there would have been some sort of, he would have kept fire from functioning for them. Again, I don't know the logistics of, it's hard to explain how miracles work because they're miracles, and so they're hard to explain. They can't be explained naturally. But there was one thing that I wanted to point out in chapter 10 and verse 21. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be a darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt." I don't know the darkest place you've ever been, but imagining palpable darkness, like a darkness to be felt for 3 days, is really incredible. And not even having, again, in our modern world, when our electricity goes out, we have flashlights, we have lanterns, we have all these different methods that we can use. It's really rare for us to be in darkness. And then also in verse 23, we have a little bit more detail. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise up from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. And so again, it's kind of hard to imagine this distinction between the people that we talked about last week, where over in Goshen, where the Israelites were living, over in kind of the camp of the Hebrews, they were able to have light, and they had fire, all of that. They were fine for these 3 days. But then just imagining it being so dark, when it says no one arose from their place for 3 days, I don't know if that literally means like everyone was sitting down and was like even scared to walk around for a couple days. I could see that being the case if you really can't see anything at all and it's this pitch black, palpable darkness, darker than any room you've ever been in, or if it just means there just wasn't very much movement because they couldn't see anything. But again, just imagining just how dark that must have been. But then also, we see in verse 24 that Pharaoh's trying to negotiate again. That's not going to work out well for him. God is not going to negotiate. But I love in verses 28 and 29, when he's having these quote-unquote negotiations that aren't really negotiations, but he's having this conversation with Moses. I love how Moses responds. Pharaoh says to him, "Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die." And Moses said, "As you say, I will not see your face again." And that is just incredible to think about, that exchange of, okay, Pharaoh, you asked for it. You don't want to see me ever again? We're gone. And so just really powerful words from Moses there. This is, again, it's hard to imagine, like I said with like the flies and the gnats and different things, it's hard to imagine it's affected over here, but it's not affected over here. This is just, again, obviously an artist's representation of what that plague might have looked like. But you think about the Egyptians wouldn't have been able to see each other. There's this palpable darkness over the land of Egypt, but somehow they would have known, whether they found out after the fact or however that worked, thinking about them knowing that the Israelites had light for 3 days. For the Israelites, it's business as usual, and yet we're sitting in the darkness. We can't even move. We can't go anywhere because we cannot see anything. Just really incredible. And then, of course, the end, the biggest, most devastating. Tim? Oh, Selena, did you have a comment? Yeah.
So I'm like really behind in my daily reading, but I read the book we were reading about, or I was reading about Joseph going to get his family and bring them in. And when Joseph brought his family in, he told them to tell them, the Pharaoh, that you are farmers, or not farmers, shepherds. So you will live and reside in the land of Goshen, because the Egyptians don't like shepherds. So when I see this, and hearing that this morning and hearing this now, I'm imagining there's a vast separation between the two, between the Egyptians in Egypt and the Israelites in Goshen. So it's very easy to turn off the lights in one room and be in another room with light, and that's kind of how I see this, is he turned off the lights in Egypt, but in Goshen, 5 miles down the road or whatever, they had light.
Right, yeah, it is interesting to think about. Again, I don't know how you visualize the Exodus, or you kind of visualize this whole setup that we have here, but Goshen was kind of a different city. I'm not exactly sure of the distance. I would have to look that up. The distance between the city that the Egyptians are believed to be in is Ramses, and so I don't know the exact distance between Ramses and Goshen. I don't know that archaeologists or historians would even know the exact geographical location of those two cities, but it is kind of interesting to think about what that distance would have looked like and what that distinction would have looked like. Tim?
So it's fascinating how God ratchets up the intensity of the plagues as he goes, but also it's one thing to lose the lights for 3 days in complete darkness and know that they're going to be back on in 3 days. They had no knowledge that that was going to happen. What if you just thought the lights would be out forever, right? That's terrifying. We're done. That's it.
Right. It is interesting. I don't know what it all was communicated to the Egyptians as these things were happening. Like, for example, with the hail plague, we know that they were told, if you go outside, you will die. And so there has to have been some sort of warning or some sort of discourse. Yeah.
Also, I don't know, this would be a little monkey wrench here, but in verse 23 it says, they did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So did they have light in their dwellings, or did they have light outside of their dwellings too? Was this darkness over the entire land, and the Israelites were able to, like you said, light fire, like lamps, and then in Egypt, where the Egyptians were, it's like dark. So, I don't know, just another way to think about it. I don't know which was the way, but verse 23, I got to figure that one out.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of things that are said here where sometimes it's, I don't know if it's a translation factor or, again, miracles are really hard to explain because how do 5 loaves and 2 fishes feed 5,000 people? What did that look like? What does speaking in tongues sound like? Or different things like that. And so it is kind of interesting to think about the logistics of some of these things. But as we get into plague number 10, obviously the most devastating of the plagues. If you had to pick which plague you would want to, if you had to rank which plagues you would want to live through. If you had to go through one, I would imagine this would be at the bottom of everyone's list, right? Just a pain and a loss like no other. We mentioned some of the Egyptians' gods last week, but obviously a loss of a child is a loss like no other. But even like we were talking about a moment ago with the livestock, knowing that the livestock were affected by this, and you think about no matter how many livestock that were left or that had been bought or had been traded or whatever the situation with the livestock is, these plagues completely ransacked the Egyptians of everything. And even after this, they're basically going to be plundered without being plundered, because they're going to be giving the Israelites things. Here, take our jewelry. Here, take our money. Like, take everything. Just leave. Please get out of here. And it's interesting, just kind of different places. We talked last week about when Pharaoh's servants turn on him and say, "Will you please let these people go? Don't you see that the land of Egypt is ruined? Don't you see this isn't working out for you? Don't you see you're losing?" And yet, in this final act, he digs his heels in, and it costs him his son. And just thinking about this, chapter 12 and verse 30, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Imagine walking out of your house in the morning, and you can hear all your neighbors wailing because there is not a house in which someone is not dead. All because Pharaoh decided to go head-to-head with the God of the universe. And he thought he could win, and he thought he was strong, and he thought he was tough, and he thought he was powerful, and this happens. And so obviously now this is just the final everything. Of course they're going to turn, and Pharaoh's going to turn, and he's going to want these people to leave. And then we have the Passover established. We'll talk more about the Passover in just a moment. But just kind of some of these pictures here that I find, it's just absolutely devastating to think about. And knowing that it happened at a specific time. So it's like this, almost like a stroke of midnight, right, where all these firstborn die, all these firstborn animals die, and you see this distinction being made here where the angel of death is looking at the blood on the doorpost, and inside they're safely having their Passover feast, obeying the laws of how the Passover was introduced, but just thinking about obviously the horror of that plague, again, because this is the process of, this is what it looks like when you try to take on God, right? And just the stubbornness there. Before we get into that, any comments on I know we're just kind of wrapping up with the plagues themselves, and we'll get into the Passover and other things in just a minute, but anything before Joanna and then Troy.
I was wondering why, God punished nations all throughout the Old Testament, and usually he just went in and had them taken out. Why Egypt got such a production out of their judgment? And I thought, well, it's not for their sake, it's for the sake of the Israelites. He's proving to them that he is God over water, over nature, over weather, over disease, over lightness and dark, and possibly even heat and cold. That might be why you don't want to get out of bed. And then over death itself. He is proving to them there is nothing left in this universe I am not in control of. And now you're going to come out and follow me in the desert.
Exactly. Right. That's a great point. And the second half of our class, we're gonna get there and talk about God's provision in the wilderness and some of those things. Troy and then Kyle.
Okay, so I've heard since I grew up in the church, everyone talks about the death angel. I do not find death angel anywhere in Scripture. And it's always bothered me because in verse 12 and 13 of chapter 12, it says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." And then in verse 13, it says, "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, when I strike the land of Egypt. And I'm wondering, where do so many people get the idea that there is a death angel and it's not the Lord? Because so many times all throughout this first part of the book of Exodus, that you may know that, or that he may know that I am the Lord. It's always referring back to God.
Right. Yeah, it's funny because, well, I know I just put that picture up, that painting of, and it had like a guy with wings, passing through. And I don't know where that idea came from. That was something I noticed as well, because it's almost more I think it's more powerful to think about God doing it himself, and he says, I'm going to do this. These are works I'm doing. And so I really don't know. I mean, that's kind of, I appreciate you pointing that out, but I don't think there is an answer to that necessarily, because it appears that God did it himself, and I don't know where that would have started. Tim and Stacy.
Ten Commandments movie.
Okay. Right, I'm sure, yeah, there have been many artist representations, media representations of this, so I'm sure it got warped over the years. Stacy, did you have something? Kyle? Or yeah. Stacy and then Kyle.
No, to that point, because I had the same thought about that. Later on in verse 23, at the end it says, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. And so I was kind of wondering, is like someone with the Lord coming and doing the destroying, or is he just, I don't know, is it just the way that it was worded or translated, kind of like you said? I don't know, but.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer. Again, there's a lot of logistics of the specifics of how these things happened, where I would be curious to, I know there are movies and things about it, and cartoons about it and things like that, but it would be curious to know what that looks like. Kyle and then Ben.
I'm not going to, some of what's on my mind I think you're about to talk about, so I won't go there, except to say that it's interesting to see how the firstborn is mentioned in the next chapter, and talking about the firstborn being consecrated and those things. But even thinking about that is in terms of the emphasis God placed on making sure that this was remembered, and that his will concerning man was passed on from generation to generation. I mean, we're sitting here thousands of years later still talking tonight about this judgment against Egypt and the death of the firstborn. God really wants us to remember this, and as a parent, I think I need to take that very seriously when I think about how important it is for me to convey this information to my children and help them understand all the aspects of God, and certainly his love and his patience, that's seen in this story, but also the judgment and severity of God against those who rebel.
Of course. You think about, I'm not a parent, but I know that my parents have told me about the ways God has worked in their lives and the things that he's done for them, and even pointing me to not only examples from their own lives, but examples from the Bible of, look at the things God has done throughout history, look how God saves his people, look how terrifying it is to be against God, and all of those things, and that you mentioned that you want to, that I hope to instill in my future kids, that have been instilled, that has been instilled in me. And again, I really mean this class to be kind of like a transition into the wilderness, obviously, because this is when they exit and this is when they enter the wilderness, and we're about to kind of talk about their journey to Sinai. But that's really kind of one of the big things, thinking about, like, when you think of the Exodus story, you think of the plagues. And we're on week 3 of 13, and we're kind of at the beginning of this class, and yet we are covering the big thing, right? But the rest of this class is going to be, remember the plagues, remember everything that happened behind you, remember everything that happened before. How could you forget? Where have you been? Did you not see this? Did you not hear about this? Why don't you remember? And so I think that's an excellent point, that the whole point is they're going to forget, unfortunately, but the part of the motivation for us studying this now is, let's not forget. Let's not go against God. Let's not. Ben and then Stephen.
In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 10, It says, nor Nineveh, some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. So you have that language in the New Testament, and then in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, which is parallel to 2 Samuel 24, when David sinned, there's an angel that is referred to as, the angel that, destroying angel. So it could be that's where that language or that's where that thought or idea comes from, where you have the destroyer in Exodus, carrying out, God's will to kill the children, or to kill the firstborn. So you have that language within the Bible.
Right. Yeah, we don't know, exactly how God works in using his angels and his messengers and doing those things, but no, those are great points to bring up. Stephen, and then move on.
This whole historical tale as truth is also recounted and used in Romans chapter 9 whenever God is trying to help those that are of Israel understand they cannot go against the will of God just the way that Pharaoh can't. I mean, they could harden their hearts later on just like Pharaoh did if they chose to. And Gentiles are going to be accepted, and this is a great example of God's will is going to persist. God is accepting them. He's showing mercy to the Gentiles. There's nothing that the Israelites can do to stop that. That is God's will. And so it's just a great example, even now. I did find it interesting in the text in Exodus 12 that Pharaoh in verse 32 says, "Bless me also." I don't know what exactly he intends by that, but he's broken at that point for a period of time. But it doesn't last. And it's just amazing that he's broken and he still just bears right back up again.
Right. We see that vicious cycle with Pharaoh where over and over again he's trying to negotiate. He loses his son. How much more could you lose? How much more could you go through and still, function at all? But again, time and time again, you just kind of see that in his personality. And here I have Revelation 16. These would be New Testament parallels. There are others that, like the ones that have been mentioned. But it's interesting when you're in Revelation when John's talking about the 7 plagues and the 7 bowls of God's wrath. There are a lot of similarities in Revelation 16 to some of these images that are being used, and I don't want to go. I really just kind of want to mention this and then move on. But I think this is just kind of an interesting passage to look about when we think of this idea of God's wrath and what that looks like when God's wrath is being poured out. These are kind of some images that we see. Obviously, things that are really being executed as a historical event, like Stephen just said in the book of Exodus, but something that we also see kind of symbolized or used as an image in Revelation 16 as well. But this is going to be about the Passover. I don't know where the title went. That's probably a glitch on my part. But this is talking about the Passover and just kind of thinking about the Passover and the reminder that it's meant to be. Obviously, it came from the 10th plague. There I have the angel of death. We've talked about that. But the Lord passes over the doors. We have this idea of the destroyer. And also, remember what I said last week about the hail plague. They were given an out with the hail plague. If you're not in the hail can't get you. And so this is kind of a little bit similar to that, where if you do this, the destroyer will pass you, I will pass you, you will be spared. And so again, we see God's mercy, despite his wrath, in wrath remember mercy, right? And so they have this way of avoiding this plague that's going to happen if they follow these rules according to the Passover. We also have the Jewish spirit. This is their new year. That's something interesting that, I hadn't thought about before or hadn't noticed before, but they're entering a new land. They're leaving the life they had before. They're entering this new era of their nationhood, if you want to refer to it that way. And he says this will be the beginning of years for you. This is new. But you also see, obviously the Passover has a lot of symbolism, but this is also a literal representation of God saving the Israelites. Obviously, he's literally passing over them, and so even the word Passover becomes symbolic, but is also literally like your house will be passed over, and you will be spared. There, the Passover. Then going back to just some special notes. It's interesting. We had a question about this in last week's lesson about them eating in haste. They're dressed. They're prepared to leave. But I want to read, or we'll read Exodus 14 in just a minute. But what did you all think? I hadn't realized for a long time, I think, that they were supposed to be, dressed and ready to go, have your shoes on, have your staff in hand, eat it fast. What did you all take from that? What lessons do we learn from the fact that they were meant to eat it so fast and be ready to go? Did that strike you as important or noteworthy? Troy?
Well, we're told all throughout the New Testament, after Jesus ascends back into heaven, be prepared. And there's definitely a parallel between the Passover and us needing to be prepared today. He wanted them to be prepared because it's going to happen quick. And, it happened pretty quick that Pharaoh was like, get out of here, take you whatever you want, and, bless me on your way out the door.
Right, right. That idea of preparation. And I think, when we talk about faith is the substance of things not seen, right? So when we think about, you would have to believe that you're actually about to go somewhere. It would be easy when you and your people and your ancestors have been in Egypt for so long. It might be easy to think, oh, we're not really going to leave. Oh, we're not really going to be able to escape. We're going to be stuck like this forever. And we do kind of see that whininess and that grumbling as we get into the wilderness. But they have to, this is literally like, get your shoes on, get ready, we're leaving. And so it's just so interesting to me that God tells them to be prepared, and the trust they would have had to think, oh wait, and I wonder, for different people, when did it kick in? Like, oh, we're actually leaving. Like, we have our shoes on and we're all packed and we have our staff for a reason, because we're, like Troy said, we're actually getting out of here. And so it's just incredible to think about. And then Exodus 14. We have the crossing of the Red Sea. In Exodus chapter 14 and verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us to bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The Lord said to Moses, Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And so this is the final act. This is it. They're being chased. They see the Egyptians behind them, and already after the Passover, after the plagues, after everything they've seen and everything we've been through, like we just mentioned a few minutes ago, seeing all these things and living all these things and being all spared from all these things, that's the context that we're working with. And yet already the Egyptians are right behind them. And I can understand that in a way it would have been difficult after living through centuries of this. But after everything that you just saw and everything that you just lived through, I love what Moses says in verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. And that's really going to be the story of the rest of the Exodus. God will fight for them. God will get you out of the most dire situations. You just need to be quiet and watch and listen and have faith. And if they would just do that, the rest of this class would be very, very different. But that's what we're working with. Kyle?
As you're saying that, it just strikes me that God allows us to get into those dire situations. You know, He allowed the people to be enslaved. He allowed them to spend all this time. The idea that God just protects us so that we never have to suffer or go through a trial is just an illusion and false doctrine among some people who claim to be Christians. But it's easy for us in our modern day America to, I think, lose sight of the fact that suffering is something that Christians typically do. It's something that we shouldn't be afraid of.
Right, exactly. We're allowed to get into these situations, and yet God still provides us a way out. Bud, and then Adam.
We talk a lot sometimes on having your own faith, and sometimes children will have faith, kind of via their parents, but it's not really their faith. You see that throughout the Exodus. These children of Israel, they don't have faith themselves yet, and that's what God is trying to get instilled in them, and each thing it should be building their faith, and we still see that a lot of them still don't get there. But that is, that's the goal. That's where they need to get, where it is their faith, and not just because Moses said so or Aaron said so, so therefore we'll do it. No, it's God said, let's do it.
Exactly. Right. Adam?
Yeah, so this made me think about, you mentioned the passage of time and how we don't know exactly how long the Exodus took, but for the purposes of illustration, it took God 40 days to get the Israelites out of Egypt. It took him 40 years to get Egypt out of the Israelites, right? So it very much speaks to culture and the hardness of our heart and how hard it is to let things go.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of like a intergenerational kind of like it's a culture, it's a family culture, it's a national culture, but it's so interesting to be reading about the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in our Sunday morning class, and to have just gotten through the patriarchs. And obviously they have their highs and their lows, but then to see these things. And as we get into from Exodus to Sinai, I want to, well, first of all, as Adam just mentioned, so if we're thinking Ramses or where the Egyptians were is here, Goshen is kind of this land over here, the Red Sea is over here, and if you look at some of those city names that we're working with, or these town names, they're gone for a while before they seem to, like when they would have gotten to the Red Sea. And so they're traveling for a while, and then they get to the Red Sea, but then, it's just kind of interesting to see they're kind of camping a little bit before it appears that they would have gotten to the Red Sea, just geographically. So that's just kind of an interesting to think about as we go throughout the Exodus and crossing over the Red Sea on dry land. But I want to pose this question in the last few minutes that we have, because we read a lot of, if you did the reading for tonight, we have a lot of stories that we would have seen of them doubting God and them not believing God in certain situations. So how would you answer this? How does God provide for the nation of Israel in the wilderness? What did you have for this while I fix my mic?
In verse 4, it mentions that bread is literally going to fall from heaven, which, if you think about that, that's kind of unusual. You don't see that in like modern day times. That was one of the miracles that God happened to do. He would provide. In fact, I think there's a saying in the Bible that there's a place called the Lord will provide it. And we'll also see later that He'll also provide meat as well. And they didn't listen to what God would say, like they should store it, and then it would eventually turn bad.
Right. Yeah, you see this. You see all these things just coming to them. I mean, it's not to make a joke of it, but if free groceries fell from the sky, in this economy, that would be amazing, you know? But they're complaining about these things like, oh, we don't like these, or like we're scared we're gonna die of thirst, but we don't want I don't want to get water this way, or we're scared of we're going to starve to death, but I don't want this bread, or I'm tired of this bread, or I'm going to try and get it all together. And you kind of see that training process like Bud was talking about, where no, just get enough for today. I promise it'll come back tomorrow. How much more evidence do you need? And we see a lot of these kind of tests. Sean, and then Stephen.
So, two things. The first one being is that they were in an environment that constantly moving, which means that they would have to feed off of the land. And there were so many people, there was absolutely no way they could have done that. So they had to lean on God in order for their daily nutrients, as a way of teaching them all the way to Sinai. Look, I'm here, I'm with you. And then the second part is that it's easy to make fun of them, of course, but complacency on something that is miraculous is one of their greatest sins, right? They get tired of bread falling from the sky, which we can all laugh at now, right? But if that just becomes your daily routine and you don't take time to look at and appreciate what's around you, that is the sin that can really take hold of just, I deserve this. This is the thing that I have. I want more, right? When outside looking in, you go, wow, that's crazy. I can't believe you did that. But I mean, anybody can do that. We can do that.
Yeah, it's such an obvious example of God being taken for granted, literally, and just this happens every day, and I have faith that it's going to happen. Maybe they kind of had faith, kind of didn't, that it was going to happen every day, but still, just after however long, they had to rely on God. There's no other option, and yet they refused to believe this. Stephen?
Yeah, I didn't notice this for a long time, but in Exodus 16, in verse 35, he says they ate manna for 40 years until they came in and inhabited land. And so you read in Joshua 5:12 that the manna stopped when they began to take of the produce of the land of Canaan. So he cared for them for those decades of time. This wasn't just until they got to Sinai, or this was the whole time. This is how God was feeding them. And then right when that finished, they were taking of the land that he promised them. He promised he was going to take care of them in the land of Canaan. It never stopped. His provisions never stopped. Really.
Exactly. And just that blessing of, I have grown up blessed enough. I've never wondered where my next meal is coming from. Right, and I know most of us, not everyone, but a lot of us here have grown up that way as well. And so just thinking about that blessing of it's free, it's the perfect amount, and yes, like Sean was saying, it's easy to make fun of them and give them a hard time of, oh, well, like, how long would it take you to get tired of eating the same thing every meal or the same thing every day? But still, just knowing that you're taken care of, and knowing that He's brought you this far, and He's made all these promises throughout the centuries, and He's kept all of them. He's not going to stop now, right? So a lot of these things that that y'all have mentioned are here. I have a passive exodus, because if you think about the exodus and the plagues, they didn't really have to do much. Just get ready, make the Passover feast, and we're leaving, right? Moses is doing all the talking. They don't have anything to do with the signs, the plagues. We also have the cloud and the fire that we'll see over and over again that are leading them. Then the Red Sea, they don't have to do anything there. Water, we have these different places where water is provided to them. Water is made sweet. And then food, like we've been talking about with the manna, when they complain of the manna, they get quail. And so they are provided something other than manna, but we'll talk in a later class about the quail doesn't go too well at one point either. But even just general safety in the sense of they're up against Pharaoh, this horrible, horrible man. And think about how scary it would be to go up against Pharaoh. He's willing to kill their children. He's willing to throw toddlers in the Nile. He's doing all these things. He doesn't care if all his land is destroyed. He doesn't care if it's making everyone sick and destroying everything. He's just digging in his heels. He's such a terrible man. And then with Amalek, their first battle once they get into the wilderness, they're delivered. They're given deliverance time and time again, and yet it seems like every time they're delivered, they turn their back, or they change their mind, or just have all these shortcomings. And then also in Moses, we have a mediator between them and God. So it's not just them talking to God on their own behalf, but they want a leader, they need a leader, and they're given a leader. Any final comment? I have one brief thing I want to mention in our last couple minutes, but any comments about this is really kind of a major summation of everything that we would have talked about in lesson 3. Yes?
So this is probably kind of like going off what Sean said a little bit. I'm sorry if I'm kind of rehashing the same thing, but it just has me thinking of like people in America. In America, we're so blessed, and we're so used to having variety and excess of stuff, and our choice of that top versus this produce that I can get out of season versus that, it's like we're so used to kind of having anything at our fingertips, and I almost wonder if Israel kind of got, I know they were enslaved, but I wonder if they kind of got used to living in Egypt, because later they were like, oh, we miss the onions and the leeks, like all these things that they had in Egypt. And I just thought of back when I was at Custer, we would send food like cornmeal to this church in I think it was Africa, because all of their meals basically were made up of cornmeal. And it's and they were so grateful that we were giving them the finances to buy cornmeal. And that was it. That was all, And so I feel like there's, obviously, but there's this lack of just gratitude for, providing. I don't know.
Right. I no, of course. I want to be careful using this phrase, because it says the devil, but it's not really talking about the devil. But we've all heard the phrase, the devil that I know is better than the devil that I don't, right? The problem that I know, the issue that I'm familiar with, the environment, albeit hard, that I'm familiar with, that I'm comfortable in. A lot of times for us, when we're comfortable and when things are easy, to a certain extent, well, I'd rather be a slave and have more food options than be free and be living in the desert, and and it doesn't compute. It doesn't make any sense, right? But there definitely is kind of that sinful temptation of I would have rather had that, right? That was behind me. We also have a justice system and laws given to them. We'll talk more about that next week. But I wanted to end with a couple theme verses. I want to compile these kind of as we go through this class and think about these things. Number one that I want us to remember as we go forward in this class is from the intro. It's the last line of the introduction, Exodus chapter 2 and verse 25. God saw the nation of Israel, and God knew. And then Exodus 14:14, the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. I think both of these ideas, both of these phrases are things that we're gonna see over and over and over again throughout the Exodus. Next week when we get to Sinai, we see this idea of God seeing the people of Israel. He knows what's going on. He knows what they need. He provides for it. And that brings us to the next one. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. We'll end there, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.